Appetite is a series of events dedicated to building community, promoting intellectualism, and supporting Black businesses. So we do this typically once a month, but every now and then we'll have 2 discussions per month. And because it's Black History Month, we wanted to do something centering on historically Black colleges and universities. Our featured business for this month is Dr. Kenyatta Cavil's Inside the HBCU Sports Lab. And so he will also be our facilitator for today. And I'm going to give him the opportunity to introduce himself and our speaker, and then we'll go into the discussion. So my role for this session will be to sort of just help keep us on track with the time. And then when it comes time for the Q&As, I'll be managing the questions and answer session. So I'll be filtering in the questions to you all. As we go through the discussion, if you all have questions, you can type them preferably in the Q&A function. That will help me stay more organized with how to relay those questions to our guests. And feel free to ask either one of them guests about their experiences with what we're talking about in today's text. So Dr. Cavil, I'm gonna hand it over to you. And I love you, I appreciate you coming, and I love your spirit and your heart for historically Black colleges and universities.
Man, first, thank you for saying that, and the feeling is mutual. I love everything about what you're doing and how you're pushing forward. When we first met, it was kindred spirits. I don't know if it was that HBCU component or just good people with good vibes, so certainly wanted to do that. Before I prolong it, I certainly wanted to honor Dr. Derrick White. It's just weird in our community, and I shouldn't say weird, it is part of who we are in our community or how we connected in so many different ways. Dr. White, as I will say here, is also a brother of mine. He is a member of a great fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So for all the brothers of 06 out there, ICE is in the house. So I certainly wanted to make that connection. With that, I'll introduce him, but let me give you a little bit more about myself. I am Dr. Kenyatta Cavil. I'm a full professor at Texas Southern University in the College of Education, and I'm in the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Sports Studies. I also have a joint appointment in the School of Communication, where I do sports entertainment on that side, and in my department, I developed the sport management program. We've done it at the undergraduate and graduate level in terms of VS in sport management and MS in sports studies and sports leadership. And I'm proud to announce one of the first places I've announced this is on the Entrepreneurial Appetite, because that's what you're about. We actually will become the first HBCU program that will offer an executive doctoral certificate in athletic administration and sports leadership. We will also have a concentration, a joint venture between the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Sports Studies I told you about earlier, and the Department of Curriculum Instruction, where now you can get your doctorate with a concentration in sports education. And so we're excited about bringing that on the table. I do Dr. Cavil's Inside the HBCU Sports Lab. It's a show traditionally streamed 6 o'clock Central Time every Tuesday on everything about HBCU sports. You can get it live. We're on KCOH 1230 AM. Any of those in the Houston area can see it driving home in that car. We just did an additional edition where we'll do Thursdays. And I say all that just to say, because I literally brought Langston on my show to prime for this. And so for all those that have jumped over here from inside the HBCU Sports Lab, I say, well, that's enough about me. This is why we're here. We're here to see Brother White, I'll call him here, Dr. White, in terms of we're moving forward. He is previously a visiting associate professor of history at Dartmouth College. Now he's a professor over at the University of Kentucky, as he's come home in a lot of ways. He's from Kentucky. He's done a lot of great work. Let me tell you something about this book. You have Dr. Ibram Kendi, who actually is an undergraduate at FAMU, for those that may not know, HBCU graduate there. He was quoted as saying, "I used to cheer in Gaither Gymnasium as a FAMU student, but I never knew of Jake Gaither, incredible stories and dominance of Black college football in mid-20th century until reading Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Integration is not wholly a story of triumph in its masterstroke of history. Derrick White shows the fall of Black college football was one of the integration's most costly casualties," end quote. And that again is by Dr. Ibram, author of Stamped from the Beginning, and how to become anti-racist. So just wanted to bring that up. Dr. Lewis Moore also is quoted in here. I won't read that for the second time, as well as Pamela Grundy. Get the book if you haven't already. I know your people here have got the book because it's part of what you do in terms of entrepreneurial appetite. Enough with that. Derrick, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here as always. Thank you, Langston. Thank you, Dr. Cavil, man. Kenyatta, it's been good. We spoke probably what, 6 months ago or more, like in the fall.
Yeah, it was right as the book was dropping. We got to had to be one of the first interviews, and I was so happy that we caught up literally as the world is so small. We were on Twitter.
Yeah, no, it's been good. So it's good to see you again, and like you, thank you for again this opportunity to talk about my book with such esteemed colleagues.
So before we get into the book, I gave you a brief introduction, but there may have been something I left out. Please share with the followers, because we like to really have a family atmosphere. We want to know each other. So tell people a little bit about yourself, or at least something that will make the connections, maybe even a bit of a funny story that you don't always talk about.
Oh man, let's see.
Yeah, put you on the spot, bro.
No, that's a good one. No, you know what it is? You know, I've always played sports, you know, like many young people across, you know, this great land. Sports is a huge industry. I played Division I soccer at the University of Maryland, and literally decided in the March of my senior year to go to the University of Maryland. I had an opportunity to go to Alabama A&M, which then had a soccer team, which I think in the last probably 10 years, they disbanded the program. And I'm still waiting on Howard University to get back to my letter from 1993 to see if they're interested in getting me coming in. You know, that didn't come in the mail. So I went to Maryland at the time. It was truly fortunate, you know, a blend of academics. You know this, most people think that when you go to Division I sports, everybody's on scholarship. And the truth of the matter is, especially in non-revenue sports like soccer or tennis or golf, that, you know, those scholarships are divided up among the entire roster. And so I was fortunate enough because my parents, my mom is a Kentucky State grad, demanded excellence in the classroom. And so that allowed me to be an asset to the soccer program at Maryland. And there I majored in math, which is kind of crazy. But I was so interested in taking my Black Studies. We had a fantastic Black Studies program at the University of Maryland. Sharon Harley, who's a Howard grad and a former Black Panther and activist, was the chair for a long time. Francine Wilson was one of my mentors and advisors. And then my last year at Maryland, I had a chance to sit at the feet of really one of the greatest scholar activists in American history, Ron Walters, who had just came over from Howard my senior year. And so Dr. Walters, you know, if you've ever sat with him, it was mind blowing. He was like, you know, when I was talking to Jesse, and he was talking about Jesse Jackson, you know, like when I was talking to Stokely, you like talking to Stokely who? Like, yes, like that was the way, because he was everywhere. So it was, you know, like many young, you know, like a lot of Black folks, man, who are educated, we're all raised and nurtured in this Black college experience, whether we went to a PWI or we attended a historically Black college. And so I'm no different. So that was really what led me. I've always been interested in trying to tell the stories of Black folks since I got into graduate school. My first book, The Challenge of Blackness, is talking about an organization called the Institute of the Black World that emerges out of the Atlanta University Center. And looking at Black studies on HBCU campuses. So this is these questions I've been wrestling with for a number, you know, for decades. And sports was just a natural kind of space, in part because I was surprised, like Ibram said in the back of the booklet, like so many people, even when I used to work in Florida, were unaware of Jake Gaither and his legacy. And I thought that was kind of tragic in some ways, right? I think that it became that we've, you know, as much as I love Eddie Robinson, he becomes a stand-in figure for the entirety of Black college athletics and Black college football in particular. And one of the things that, as I began researching this book, is it was really clear that Florida A&M was a pace setter in the post-World War II period. in which all the other programs were trying to keep up, and they marked their season success, whether or not they made it to the Orange Blossom Classic and they beat FAMU. That was a lot of ways that teams measured a successful season for nearly 30 years while he was the head coach there.
No doubt about it. And we get a little bit into it. I want to really take a deep dive as you get in chapter 5 and 6, which really gets into focus and what I call in some of my frameworks and texts and journal articles that I write is what I call, you know, the heyday in a lot of ways, the really dynasty period, if you would, of what goes on there. And you kind of told us why about this project. And I really like the way that you make the connection about what I refer to as the HBCU sports culture. We've had other people talk about it in terms of HBCU studies, but that is extremely important. But I want to go to the next part of this in terms of this. How long did it take you to write this project?
Oh man, let's see. I think I have some like early drafts from like 2009, so like a decade. Like I had this brief idea, like as I was finishing my first book, my plan was like, oh, I'm gonna turn around and write this short book on Florida A&M football, and I'm gonna get it done in 3 years. And you know, I had like everything, life happens. I had kids, I changed jobs, and it just, you know, the research and you know, sometimes to do the story right, it really required me to really take my time and do it. And I think that was one of the things that I was actually most proud of, is that I think there were some easy answers that could be found, but I really wanted to make sure and dig. And I felt like one of my concerns when I started the project was that we didn't have the really robust history of Black sports. We had individual stories. We have books, great biographies of John McClendon. We've had great books on Eddie Robinson, right? But one of the things that those books and articles didn't do well was that they never tied the whole thing together in a way that was satisfactory. And so I think part of what took me so long was I really shifted from telling a story about Gaither and Florida A&M and really trying to think about the ways in which both the institution and Gaither's career was representative of the larger narrative of HBCU football. Going all the way back to World War I, when you know, in the 19 teens, when Gaither played at Knoxville College, right? I wanted to understand that kind of legacy and bring it all the way up to his death in 1994.
It's really beautiful how you put that together. I've always been fascinated that, and again, it's part of what I put out there in research, is oftentimes when we look at history, and particularly it seems like Black history, HBCUs, Africana studies, however you want to frame it, we tend to celebrate these individual accomplishments, but not very often do we talk about the institutional accomplishments. In a lot of ways, what I thought was really beautiful about this book, that as you said, and I'm glad that you took the time and what great authors do in so many different ways, and why I think this book is beautiful and masterful, and just that you share that institutional framework, that institutional love. And so tell me the connections about why that it's important to not only look at individual successes, if you would, or even individual failures, but to look at things also from potentially an institutional level.
Yeah, one of the things that was really clear, I think one of the big contributions this book makes is this concept of what I call a sporting congregation, right? Really thinking about sports, not just as coaches or players, but really trying to think about the totality of how this gets organized, right? And so part of what led me there is, you know, Coach Gaither, he used to say, he would say, because this is hyperbole, you work in college sports, you know how college coaches operate. He was like, 95% of the high school coaches are my guys, right? Like, and you would be like, then some years it's 90%, and then some years it's 100%, but he was basically making this claim that the vast majority of high school coaches in the state of Florida were alums of Florida A&M, and that they had played for him. And I was like, instead of, just taking that as coach speak, I actually tried to figure out if that was true by looking at all the high schools, figuring out who the coaches were. And really that opens up this window when you realize that the head coaches at the high school level are Florida A&M alums. If you realize that the principals are Florida A&M alums, You realize that the lawyers in Miami are Florida A&M alums, right? That you begin to understand that this network of not only players and coaches and faculty on campus, but this huge network of alums, teachers in high school. The Black media was absolutely essential. You cannot have what I call the golden age of Black college sports without a robust Black newspaper industry, where we have, the Atlanta Daily World and the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. Like, these papers are going national stories every day. You could find out about what's happening at Tuskegee, even though you live in Harlem, right? And so this has given me as a scholar, like, okay, now I can understand the lay of the land in the sense. And so to me, the sporting congregations is essential, because that gets us away from, it reduces our emphasis on personality and really looks at the institutional mechanisms that allowed for success. And so Gaither is many ways, the success at Florida A&M, you can plug in anyone else, right? You can plug in Mumford at Southern, Billy Nix at Prairie View. You can plug in, Earl Banks at Morgan State, and you can tell a very similar story about how they were able to create. And so that's what, I wanted to make it more representative. And I think that's, to me, is the big takeaway from the book.
No doubt about it. The way you weave into the stories of Jake Gaither, you weave out of that into the stories of FAMU, and then you take it into that context of HBCU sport culture, what I call also the sporting HBCU diaspora in so many different ways. You weave that story fascinatingly. And I'm not going to let you just get that quick and jump in there and throw that Black sporting congregation at us and not really take a deeper dive in it. You're quoted as saying, although the same notes appear, Black needs much like a jazz musician in the jam session. As you talk about that, it's really fascinating. As you talk about in this particular quote, although the same notes appear, Black colleges, communities improvise, making the chords and composition all their own, end quote. I thought that was fascinating when you talk about the culture of HBCUs, the sporting culture, how it is a mosaic in some ways. So I really wanted to go back in a little bit, because I want to come back to that Billy Nix and dropping this in different areas, Mumford, and talking about those matchups. I want to do that a little later, but I think I would be doing a disservice to all those here listening if I didn't give you another chance to take even us a more deeper dive, because you really talk about that in chapter 1, and then again in chapter 2, as an opening for folks to really understand this framework, as you put it, the Black sporting congregation. Tell us a little more about what does that mean?
I mean, I think, one of the things that we have to, understand, like, I was working at Dartmouth and when I was finishing the book, and the Ivy League in the Northeast is really the home of college football. We forget, in the midst of, the SEC and our concern about Alabama and all these places, that the founding moment is, Princeton and Rutgers. And those dominant teams of the 19th and early 20th century are Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, right? And so one of the things that I always, being in that space and actually looking at those Dartmouth documents from the late 19th century and early 20th century are really helpful, because those same kinds of questions, institutional, who are we going to play? Why are we going to play these games? Those are questions that are often consuming Black college sports as well at the same time, right? So the questions are not different, but what's really interesting is that the experience of Black college life and Black college institutions, the segregation forces them to create a new kind of phenomenon, right? And I think that they are, because they don't have access to the same kinds of spaces that white colleges have, they are really forced to create new things. So one of the best things that we take for granted, the Classic is a cornerstone of Black college athletic life, right? But the Classic is really, in some ways it mimics what white colleges are doing when Lincoln and Howard play on Thanksgiving Day. That's what all the major colleges did. But when we see, for instance, Southern play at the Louisiana State Fair or Prairie View playing at the Texas State Fair, that is a byproduct of the fact that was the colored weekend at the state fair. right? And so it was part of a larger community thing, community institution. Like, this is the only weekend we get to go to the state fair. So we about to have a football game. We about to have a party. We about to go, kids get to ride the fair and have cotton candy. Cause this is the only time that they're going to let, in those days, Negroes in the state fair. Right. And so we create, Black college football is very much tied to those kinds of institutions. And out of that particular kind of moment, that Black colleges create something radically different than predominantly white colleges, right? White PWIs don't have classics. They have rivalry games, they have bowl games, but they don't have a classic. That classic is something that comes out of the same kind of process of how we're going to play and when we're going to play. But because of segregation, Black folks create something new. And so that's what I'm looking at, is this is really, I think, about the congregation, because it requires Black folks in the state of Texas and Louisiana and other states to push to have a weekend or a week for Black folks to even go to the fair, right? To remind people that they are taxpayers and that this state fair should include Black participation. And then from that, then becomes Black colleges who are able to institute games. So I see this as part and parcel of that kind of network. The other piece that I think that is important for me is that I don't think historically the history of Black college athletics has not done a great job of telling its origin story, right? To tell this story of, how the CIAA comes into being, how the SWAC comes into being, how the SAIC comes into being. Like, that conference relationship, that is a fascinating conversation. And so when you look through the documents, and I was fortunate that Florida A&M has some really great archives of stuff in a J. Gaither archive. And I was able to find, for instance, the 50th anniversary of the SAIC. And I'm like, where they had the founding documents in it, right? Where they were talking about, this is what, these were reproductions of these founding documents. You're like, oh, okay, this is the argument they're making for creating conference affiliation. This is why they don't go to the CIAA. This is why they don't go to the SWAC. That these are very much part of institutional creation. And I think that's part of the story needed to be told as well, because I think we just take it for granted that these conference alignments have always been the same. And I think this is an interesting year as we watch, Florida A&M and Bethune-Cookman leave the MEAC and head over to the SWAC. Like, that's a big deal, but there was always a lot of movement and questions about, the relationship between particular programs and particular conferences. And I thought that was an important part of the story, because that brings in the presidents, that brings in what we think of as faculty members. They didn't have quite athletic directors in that term, but those folks who were in charge of athletics are having these kinds of conversations about how they should cooperate. Some of that includes Booker T. Washington. Some of that include, these are major heavy hitters in Black life, asking these questions about how athletics should be organized and who should be in charge of it. And I think that's an important conversation. So that gets me into, that gets me off the field in a sense, right? It gets us not into that kind of concept. And I guess the third piece of this sporting congregation is I also wanted to talk a little bit about the greatness of coaches. And this kind of gives me that, when we talk about football in general, we talk about these great coaches, Vince Lombardi and Bear Bryant, and Black folks are never included in that number. And I thought that this was an opportunity to really tell the story and of kind of innovation on the field. One of the early drafts had significant X's and O's, and my colleague at Dartmouth, she was like, this is a fantastic book. She's like, but I don't know anything about football. So we got to figure out how to tell this part of the book about, pulling guards and stuff. Like, she wanted to know, how can we make that saying in a way that signals its importance, but not push readers away who are not really concerned about those things. But more the broader question is, I wanted to tell these stories. And I think that this goes back to my earlier point, where I think the longevity of Eddie Robinson obscures the greatness of generations of coaches, whether it's Cleveland Abbott on the other side of, World War II and the work that he did at Tuskegee, to Gaither or Knicks. I think individual school alums are fully aware of the greatness of their coaches. Their buildings and athletic facilities often bear their names, but the broader public of college football is not very aware of the kind of impact that these men had on people's lives.
No doubt about it. It's so wonderful that you go into that deep dive and really explain the Black sporting congregation. And you allude to some of these great coaches, and I'm so glad that you got into that. The quality coaching, talking about Cleve Abbott at Tuskegee, Harry Graves at Wilberforce, Fred Long at Wiley College, Edward Hurt at Morgan State, Arnold H. Mumford in terms of Texas College before he goes to Southern and everybody falls in love with him. Henry Arthur King of Kentucky State, that is not always looked at, and he was at Tennessee A&I. But you're talking about some of the smaller HBCU programs that dominated really early, particularly those private schools, and you play homage to them as you weave throughout these stories. So I thought that was so fascinating. Again, when you talk about these great coaches, because I think it is important when you start talking about this Black sporting congregation and take it beyond just sport. I had a recent article that I got to do with Brian, writer of mine, and just wanted to quickly break down because you weave in between Billy Nix, who was probably one of the biggest adversaries at that time. So I was going to ask you about rivalries and who you thought were some of the biggest. But one thing that I wanted to point out to our followers and out there and get your thoughts on this as well, as we kind of mix this up and go in and out of the book just for history, so we really tie this in. From 1958 to 1961, listen to some of these coaches that you talk about. You had Prairie View A&M and Jackson State. You had Big John Merritt. Billy Nix was 2-1 against him doing that. And resume for Merritt, 7 Black College National Championships, 5 Midwestern Athletic Association. And I like the fact that you tie in the Midwestern Athletic Association, which is a conference that no longer exists, so it's lost a lot of that historical nature, and you're able to find space for it and talk about the importance of those interconference rivals. 2 SWAC championships, Prairie View, Southern, Coach Ace Mumford was 2-2. Mumford was 6 Black College championships, 13 SWAC titles. Eddie Robinson that has that longer, and so he's at the front of some of these coaches that are exiting, these great coaches that you talk about, but it goes long after that, and which allows him, to his credit, to get all these wins. But he has 9 Black College championships, 1 Midwestern Athletic Association before he goes to the SWAC, and 17, crazy as it is in the SWAC. Texas Southern, in terms of Alexander Dooley. You have Wiley College with Fred Long, and then the legendary Jake Gaither. He's 1-1 in terms of the Orange Blossom Classic, 2-1 overall. Obviously, we know about Jake Gaither, 8 Black College championships, and depending on how you measure, some say 5, 6, depending on who's measuring it. 20 SIAC championships, 3 SIE Division A championships. This crazy numbers, but I bring all that up to ask you in terms of how you define rivalry first, right? And what does it mean when you look at HBCUs in that rivalry? And tell us a little about what you unearthed between that rivalry that's off the beaten path, but I think is one of the biggest ones because it was in the middle of who would win Black College National Championships. They had some co-championships with Billy Nix, and I talk about that from 1957, 59, and 61. Those undefeated seasons that you talk about. But you have Prairie View in 53, defeating FAMU in the Orange Blossom Classic 33-27. And then in 58, Prairie View does it again, 26-28. But not to be undone, Jake Gaither comes back and closes out and wins in 59, 28-7. Talk about what did you dig up and put in your books as you framed it to some way between Prairie View and FAMU, and I'm going to tell you about the second part of why I think that's important.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that Prairie View was, dominant. There's a stretch in there where in the mid 50s to about 63, 64, where they're like, Billy Nix, they're co-equals with Gaither and they're co-equals with Southern, right? Like, I think that we forget that these programs have massive runs. And this is going to give me an opportunity, I think, to talk about the Orange Blood. One of the things that's really clear is that when Florida A&M creates the Orange Blossom Classic in 1933, I make a note that they were a absolute terrible program, right? So the thinking about that in 1933, they had been like, we're gonna host this big game in Florida in December, and we're gonna get leading programs to come, the best intersectional games we can find. They had only won 11 games in the previous decade, right? They're right, they've had 4 coaches at this point. Like it is a lot of confusion in the athletic department. But one of the things that J.R.E. Lee Jr. recognizes is that, one, FAMU has, in many ways, the best location of these institutions who are concerned about, because they're like, look, you could come to Florida, initially Jacksonville, and then by 1947, Miami, you could come and spend vacation time in early December, coming to a football game, and we're going to be able to sell out. And people got behind that game. And so it's through the Orange Blossom Classic that as Florida A&M really starts to ascend the ranks beginning in the late 30s, and then definitely on the other side of 1945 after World War II, this is where you can really see the rivalry start to emerge. For Prairie View, that rivalry against FAM takes place primarily in the Orange Blossom Classic. But the rivalry against Southern, which is interesting because they're in the same conference, is often a regular season conference. And so we see home and home games against Southern, where Southern comes to Tallahassee and FAM goes down to Baton Rouge. And, one of the very first night games at Southern is against Florida A&M under the line. So this is part of this, what we begin to really to really develop. One of the interesting things is that in the SIAC, the FAM doesn't really have a rival, right? Once they kind of vanquished Morris Brown, which is really kind of one of the more stronger programs from before World War II into the opening years after World War II, they don't have a consistent rival. I mean, there are years where they don't lose a game. I mean, they're like at one point like 58-1 or something in the conference.
Right.
And so the only way that they can actually determine their quality to show is they schedule all these great programs from around the country. And so primarily you see Southern coming in regularly. Eventually it's Tennessee State. Those folks come in the regular season. And so that really kind of, they have those teams in particular, Tennessee State, Southern, create a regular season rivalry. In the Orange Blossom Classic, they're able to kind of say whoever's really playing well at that time. So you'll have stretches where Prairie View comes 3 times in like 4 years or something like that. And then you'll have Alcorn will be there when they're having a strong run. Morgan State comes, Eastern Shore comes. And so they are able to really tag, like, look, if you're having a great year, you get to come down here. Obviously, Grambling comes like 5 times in Gaither's career in his 25 years. And so I think that's the Orange Blossom Classic, is how they're able to establish these consistent rivalries with the teams, with the exception of Southern and Tennessee State. Those 2 programs were regular season non-conference rivals on a regular basis, and they really begin to define their season. There's lots of kind of the president at FAMU is George Gore, who had worked at Tennessee State. Howard Gentry had played for Gaither, and he was a coach for a few years when they won a national title after Henry King died, and then he becomes the athletic director. And so there are some like personal relationships. Some of the Southern is that you just got on the highway and could go west. It was some of it's like a straight shot between Baton Rouge and Tallahassee, and it's probably about as far as they are willing to travel in those days by bus, and they're able to get there. So I think there's a lot of some of it's geography and some of it's just ease of travel that allow for these relationships to flourish, and that's why they don't play Prairie View regularly during the season, because that's just too far to travel by bus. For something that's not as big as the Orange Blossom Classic. And now the reason Prairie View comes is they're getting guaranteed money. They're getting a cut of the ticket prices, and their alums want to go. And you got to, by the 1955, if you wanted to say you were the national title, you had to make sure you played FAM that year, or people were going to question it. And that's just kind of the way that they had to establish their program.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so you talk about Henry King at Tennessee A&I and then Tennessee State. Obviously, John Merritt gets in there going. But during this time, you have a legendary basketball coach at Tennessee A&I, now Tennessee State, in terms of John McClendon. But you tell a little interesting story that really piqued me, talking about Jake Gaither, hearing the stories about the secret game. And it gets into Gaither as he pushes forward for desegregation of some of these playoffs, because that's what these basketball coaches are doing as they create the National Steering Athletic Committee and find a way to desegregate the NIA in basketball with this District 29, right? But they're trying to do this on the football side. So tell a little bit of what you found in your research as you put in the book, and really talk about that connection that people may not realize with John McClendon and hearing these stories and how it pushed Gaither.
Yeah, no, John McClendon and Harry Jefferson, who was the AD at Virginia State, I believe, and these folks were really instrumental in trying to get District 29 in the NAIA tournament. The NAIA, black schools were not, formally affiliated with the NCAA, and the NAIA provided an opportunity, which was because it started as a basketball conference, provided an opportunity for black colleges to really, they pushed and pushed and pushed to finally let their teams in. And John McClendon, Tennessee State, was able to win 2 national titles. You look at the list, man, that, Grambling wins a national title. They go to the Final Four. Black colleges get, 1 team in, and they're like, they make the Final Four, I feel like 8 out of 10 times or something like that. And so when the NAIA just expands to other sports, including football, Gaither sees this as an opportunity. They expand in the early 1960s. And he's like, okay, this is our chance. They've already done this on the basketball side. By this time, Tennessee State has already won 2 national titles. So he sees this as an opportunity to demonstrate that, Florida A&M is not just the best black college. They are the best team, and we are willing to show and prove it. And they're constantly frustrated in a number of ways. The most essential is that the NAIA championship game moves to Florida, to St. Petersburg. And Florida A&M, they have this because they're quintessential. We start off with a pretty soft schedule. So you look at, week 1 and 2 in the schedule for Florida A&M, and if they ain't scored 60 points, people were upset. And so, they start the season 2-0, and they done scored 120 points. And it forces the NAIA to be like, well, we got to consider Florida A&M as a potential candidate for this national title game, or this tournament national, Final Four semifinal game at this point. And so the NAIA reaches out to the governor, and the governor's like, no, you can't do it. Because he also is understanding that, like, they got to maintain segregation, and they may be willing to let integrated teams play in Florida, but they were not quite ready to let Florida A&M as an all-black team play against a white team in the state of Florida, in part because I think that one of the things that's happening in the coaching network, black and white, is that these white coaches realize that, like, they might be good, but we don't know if we that good. And I think that, like, part of it by 1955, to the early 60s, it's clear that if they're paying attention, that they don't have the same kind of talent. They may be able to beat Florida A&M, but they're going to be at a talent deficit. Gaither used to always say, look, if you can't run the 100 in under 10 seconds, you can't play in my backfield. And the world record is like 9, 100-yard dash. The world record is like 9.4. And he's like, if you can't run but 2 steps slower than the world record, you can't play for me, right? I want us to understand what that means. And so, like, his point was always the same. He's like, look, I can run these same 10 plays because if I get a crease, it's good night. And this is what they were doing. They averaged in the 1957, 58, 59, and 60, they averaged over 50 points a game. And I think they probably threw the ball twice a game for 4 straight years. And so it was like, look, we're not even going to throw it, and we're still going to score half 100. And I think that's part of it is, part of it. Like, Bob Hayes is in the Hall of Fame, the NFL Pro Football Hall of Fame. And the thing that I have to remind people is that he was a backup part-time running back at Florida A&M, right? He got all the press, and other people were upset, but he wasn't a regular starter for any of his 4 years at Florida A&M.
Now that's going in.
Right? Like, and I think that this is the thing. And then, and on the other side of the equation, what made Eddie Robinson's Grambling team so amazing is my favorite story. They play, Grambling is playing FAMU in the 50s, in the late 50s, early 60s in the Orange Blossom Classic. And they're like this, Gaither's got all these fast guys, speed guys, all of them about 5'9", 160, 170, and they all run like lightning. And Eddie Robinson was like, that's okay, because I got these linemen that are really big. And so you look at the data, and he has 4 linemen that have all weigh 270 pounds or greater, including Buck Buchanan, on his defensive line. And Buck Buchanan, for those who are unfamiliar, was the first HBCU player drafted #1 overall by the Kansas City Chiefs in 1963. Buck Buchanan played at 6'3", 285 pounds. We always talk about, can we take a person from the 60s and put them in today's game? Buck Buchanan and Deacon Jones and Jim Brown. There are a handful of guys you'd be like, yeah, they can play in it. It don't matter where. On the moon, they could play, right?
Exactly.
And Grambling wins that game against FAMU in part because their defensive line was so much bigger and stronger that Gaither couldn't get his run game off. And so you see these techniques, right? One of the things I really was interested in is like getting into some of the actual football strategy making and recruiting strategies and thinking about, we treat, I think the scholarship treats Black college athletics as this kind of naturalism, if that makes any sense. Like, of course, Black colleges are good because y'all had all the Black athletes, but like part of it is, my counterexample is that none of the schools in Georgia, for instance, had consistent success in Black college football, right? Morris Brown had a nice run in the 40s, but none of the school HBCUs in Georgia. Well, when we do the math, like Georgia had the highest percentage of Black people for since 1890 to 1970 on a consistent basis. So it can't just be the presence of Black people and Black colleges. There has to be something else happening in that equation, right? And that forces us to really grapple with the kind of coaching acumen and the recruiting strategies and what people were looking for. Gaither wanted speed. Eddie Robinson had size. Billy Nix had quarterbacks who could throw the football. There was a thing where they were averaging 200 yards passing a game in 1963 and 1964. Well, that would have led the entire country in passing in those days, right? Like, this is a big deal, right? We think about John Merritt, like he has a strategy. He's like, look, he had passing quarterbacks for decades, right? Eddie Robinson, we give him so much credit because he makes the transition from a running offense to a passing offense with Shaq Harris. That's the only reason you get Doug Williams, is because he makes a conscious decision that I'm going to recruit quarterbacks, let them throw the football, but I also got to learn how to call offense that allows them to throw the football. I think that's an important part of that conversation that too often just gets caught up in like, well, they had Black players and thus they were good. Like, no, that there was, defensive and offensive genius in the coaching staffs and the recruiting strategies. There's reasons why certain guys got out of the state of Florida, right? Deacon Jones had he didn't get along with his high school coach who played for Gaither. That was a flag, right? Like, he's like,
right.
Can he play? He's like, yeah, he can play, but you don't want that. That was the answer, right? Like,
he gonna do what he want to do.
Right. And that was like, that's how he gets to South Carolina State initially, right? Like, this is part of the equation that we, if we're telling our stories, we love to tell those kinds of stories about Alabama or tell those stories about Notre Dame or Michigan or Ohio State. But I think Black colleges are worthy of having that same conversation as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful. As we start to get into these questions, we could go back and forth, but I really want to make sure that we get these people with these questions. And the last thing I'll say is digging this, for those that hadn't gotten to it, you talk about the mix between CIAA and the Mid-Athletic Conference, or MAA as they call it, how they decided to have a game and lock FAMU out, and Gaither is fired up. I think it's enormous when you also give insight, and that's why I wanted to tie in the Billy Nix early, is that while Gaither is hearing John McClendon and Tennessee A&I, Tennessee State now, talk about that, it's Prairie View that gets the opportunity to play in that first desegregated championship game and loses their arch rival. So it all ties in together. So it's so many beautiful stories that you put in there that I wanted to tease a little bit of that out. But with that, let's get into some of these questions and answers. And depending on how many you have, we can revisit some other components. But I really wanted to get the participation for folks involved. So Langston, help me in terms of making sure we get these questions involved.
Yeah, so I'll be relaying some of the questions in to you all. If you all who are in the audience, if you can use the Q&A function, that'll help me stay organized with the questions that you ask. And if you are okay with it, I will give some of you the opportunity to ask your question live, okay? So I will unmute you and give you the capability to ask. And so while you all are going through that, I'm gonna go to the first question that was in the chat. And it was, and you may have touched on this when you were talking about strategy, Dr. White, a little bit earlier, but could you maybe give us a bit more insights into the coaching philosophy or characteristics that made Gaither so successful?
Yeah, I mean, Gaither's a unique individual, and like he has a unique life story, which is one of the reasons I wanted to tell his story is that you know, Gaither did not have any children. He survives two brain tumors, which are surgically removed in World War, you know, in the 1940s, right? Like the life expectancy even in 2021 would be low if you had two brain tumors, right? We would be worried about whether you would make it. Gaither had this surgery in a segregated South in 1943. And I think that, to me, what that does is when he survives that surgery, he really is invested in these young men as a father. We always say, well, they're a father figure, but he really doesn't have any children of his own. So he begins to adopt that. So I think that one of the things that you read from both alums in the documents of the age, whether you're talking about Bob Hayes or individuals who just recently passed away, they talked about how Gaither was they were part of that family, that he was like their father figure. I think that really does play an important part. Not to say that other coaches didn't do this, but this was extremely effective for Gaither. Gaither also recognized, and he picks up strategies. Like Gaither is innovative, but he's innovative in this world in a way that other people are already doing. So Cleveland Abbott, for instance, in Alabama, created the Tuskegee Relays, basically, as a way to locate talent, athletic talent, and get them to come to Tuskegee, right? Ed Temple will take this idea and implement it at Tennessee State, right? This is how he's able to get all the, you know, if you're 14 and you can run, you come to Tennessee State Relays and you almost got a chance to go to Tennessee State. This is how they're dominant. Gaither's doing much of the same thing, that they're having their tournament and their relays in Tallahassee on their campus. This is what it means to be the state HBCU. And they're able to do this. And one of the things that's really clear is he becomes connected to speed. Like he just believes that speed kills, and he's very adamant and clear about it. And part of it is, this is like really kind of X's and O's, is that the most dominant offense formation that folks used in the 1940s was the T formation. And so what Gaither does is he takes a variation of this that had been developed at other schools called the split line T, which means he spreads his linemen out a little bit further. And the only reason he does that is because he wants teams to kind of jump in the gap and that they can be easily pushed aside, because he's like, I got all these guys who can flat out run. So I want to create space for them to run. This is not really any different than the modern spread offense. If you watch college football today, where if you know, I grew up on college, you know, Big Ten country in the old days, you line up in an I formation, you got two tight ends, everybody's running in this little narrow space. And what these schools realized, we should spread them out. Well, Gaither was spreading folks out in 1940, 1950. And what he had when he had Willie Gallimore and Bob Paramore and you know, Bob Hayes and a whole bunch of other folks who could run like the wind. And so that worked for him in a real kind of way. And I think that becomes part of his strategy. And so once you played for Gaither, you knew what kind of guys he liked. And so all I got, there was no pro football until 1947 for the vast majority of these college graduates. And so what they end up doing is they get their physical education degree. They went back and they became coaches at the high school level. And so this allows for them to develop this recruiting strategy. And so for him, it was speed. It is very clear. He talks about speed in the 1940s. He brags about the speed at his coaching clinic. He's like, y'all ain't got nobody as fast as my guys. Like he tells Bear Bryant, like, that ain't gonna work. And he's like, can your guys run? Like that's the question he would say. Because if not, you're gonna be running the back, like you be chasing them for when we score in the football, right? And so I think that's very clear about how he approached. And each coach, and because for narrative sake, I think I wanted to focus on Gaither alone, but I tried to give a little bit of insight about how his opponents and how they're trying to defeat them are also experimenting with different approaches to their recruiting and their coaching philosophies. And I think that's an important kind of dynamic.
Yes, thank you for sharing. We have AJ Newton Anderson who would like to pose her question.
Hey, Dr. White and Dr. Cavil.
Hello.
My question for you both, whoever wants to ask it, was I was on Twitter today and I saw that Alabama A&M and UCLA just signed a contract to play each other, I think in 2023. And I think for a lot of people, we hear about these games and we, past experiences, we think about guarantee games. We think about how these games have just been used for financial purposes or they end up hurting HBCU football players. Is that still a thing, how it used to be maybe a couple of years ago where we would hear about guarantee games, or has HBC football evolved to where these are games that are not just set up for financial purposes?
So the short answer is that for every small school, right, if you're not in a Power 5 conference with a big TV contract, every school is going to operate in what we call guarantee games, right? So this is part and parcel of how the economics of college football work, right? It trickles down, right? And so when I was at Ohio State, I always talk about they make, anywhere between $1 and $3 million every home football game. This is before television. Right. This is just on tickets and Coca-Cola and parking and gear. Right. This is how much they're going to sell when you have 100,000 people there on your day. Right. Everybody's going to spend, $20 to $30 times 100. This is how you get 3 million. Right. This is how this is going to work. And so these games are still in existence. I think that the challenge for HBCUs is that their finances, their budgets are so tight that these games are essential for financing the entire athletic department, both these games and the basketball games. I always joke that like small colleges, when school lets out, they go on the road for basketball for like a month. Like, you'll be like, they're bouncing around. They're at UK and then they're in Texas and they just make a swing. And then they may not play at home for another month because they're out there getting guaranteed games. The guarantees in basketball are much smaller than they are in football. So I will say that's that. So that's the frame. I think it depends on whether these games are competitive depends on, each program, right? I think North Carolina A&T has proven that, East Carolina is not going to try to schedule them anytime soon.
I'm sorry. I just have to say Aggie Pride because
right. Aggie Pride.
That's my school.
Right.
That's my school. And I'm going to be completely honest. When we beat ECU, I was like, we beat a white school. And every time we beat a white school, I have a little party in my heart because I know we creeping up just a little bit. Just a little bit.
And that's important because they got paid. It's my favorite. Twitter gives us a meme. The coach is like, bring me my money, right? Like that, because that's the ultimate goal, right? I mean, this is why we still talk about Appalachian State defeating Michigan in the Big House, right? Like they got $1 million and they got to win, right? This is a big deal, right? So I think that there's an important part of, we love every college football season. We see these kind of Cinderella stories. Coastal Carolina went out and beat Iowa State, I think this year, and they beat Kansas. We like those stories because that allows for us to understand, make us believe that there's some kind of parity in college football. But the reality is that for these schools, black or white, they need to take these games in order to balance their athletic budgets, because this is the way in which, people get paid in their athletic department, and they keep the scholarships and they offer scholarship for their entire department. So it is unfortunate, A&M playing UCLA it was an interesting strategy. We'll see if it bears out, if they can be competitive. I just worry, the biggest worry that you have as a fan is what, for instance, like when Ohio State or one of these really big programs plays, they can physically injure someone because they have, Ohio State has a $200 million athletic budget and, numerous 4 and 5 star guys, and the game is dangerous enough as it is. And so you want to try to keep it as level as possible.
Yeah, thank you, AJ, for that question. Want to go to one of the anonymous guests was asking a question about the status of integration when we think about championships. And so I'm going to massage that question just a little bit. I know you're a historian, but I'm going to ask you to be somewhat of a prophet and look into the future. We have Deion Sanders at Jackson State, and I think he made some comments about like we want to play in a bowl game against a predominantly white institution. And so how do you see integration playing out in the future in terms of the way the institutions are integrated in competition on a more level playing field with, the larger PWIs?
Man, this is both a historical question and a future question, right? Like one of the things that I talk a lot about, I spend like the last third really talking about how Gaither and others really pushed the NCAA to allow them to participate in a tournament. And Gaither as the athletic director is really going to be instrumental in getting, Black colleges into 1AA and then allowing Florida A&M to win the first 1AA national championship. But the reality of it is that A&T is would make more money from the Celebration Bowl than they would from going to the 1AA or the FCS playoffs, right? And so this is the thing. I think one of the things that makes me worried about Deion is that he is referencing a Division I model, like a FBS model that is not a reality for the FCS, right? That Jackson State, even if they go undefeated, is not going to play in the Rose Bowl. They're going to go to the FCS playoffs and they get a chance to take on, North Dakota State or something like that. That's going to be the path for them going forward. And so I think that that's part of it. So the notion of championships, I think this is a question that Black colleges are struggling with, right? Like Tennessee State is in the OVC. They're trying to figure out, if they could put together a really strong year, they can get into the tournament, the playoffs, and figure out, A&T left the MEAC to go to the Big South along with Hampton, right? This is a decision that now puts them in a path that's squarely in the FCS playoff and removes them from the lucrative deal that they had in the Celebration Bowl, right? And so the Celebration Bowl pays better. It gives them more recognition. It's the only game on ESPN. It's not on ESPN Plus or ESPNU or ESPN, ESPN 8. I have no idea how many they have now, right? And so it gave, my former roommate from Ohio State, who's an Aggie, always says, he's like, there's a reason, we think that we can draw a line between, North Carolina A&T being the largest HBCU and its success in the Celebration Bowl. Like people are watching these games and they are, they can name, one other school besides Howard, Morehouse, and Spelman, right? Like this is, if they have no experience, right? They're like, oh, okay, like A&T, I seen them on TV. They look like they're having a good time. They win. They fans look like they're having fun. I like those colors. Like applications go up, right? And that allows for them to really go to improve. And so I think there's a risk reward. I think the money is perhaps more secure in the Big South, but there's tremendous risk. And so that's both in whether they go through the playoffs, which I think is a losing proposition in terms of money, but it can improve their prestige vis-a-vis kind of integrationist logic. But that's the task at hand. I think that's the conundrum that I think all HBCUs are facing at some level.
Yeah. So I want to be respectful of y'all's time. I'm gonna sneak in one more question because I know it's like 9 o'clock where you are, Dr. White. And so when we think about the greatness of coaches, Okay. It's the players at the collegiate level, it's the players you put in the league, it's the wins and it's the losses. And I think more so at the professional level, it's your coaching tree. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of talk to us about Jake Gaither in terms of his uplift. Like, what was his role in uplifting other Black coaches? And what was his role as a mentor in general to these Black men who were on FAMU's football team?
No, I think that's a great. My friend RJ Young just wrote an article for Fox News recently, and RJ references this story that I talk about in the book about that when Bob Hayes was a freshman, he had gotten arrested for allegedly like robbing some store. I think it was a classmate or a teammate, and he's in jail. And can you imagine being in 1960 Florida jail? He pled to something that he didn't do. Gaither finds out, goes down to the jailhouse, and then eventually to court and says, "Give me this young man and he will stay out of trouble. I can guarantee it." He had developed such a reputation that the criminal justice system would give him an opportunity to reclaim Bob Hayes, literally save his life. And I think that speaks to who he was. And at the time, Bob Hayes was not a star player. Bob Hayes was on the freshman team in the pit, as they like to say. He had not broken any records in the 100. He just thought that this young man who was his high school coach, had played for Gaither earlier, right? So he saw him as part of his family. When we think about the legacy of coaching trees, I think that's a fascinating question. I think that this is often much more difficult for Black colleges and for that generation of Black college coaches, right? Many of these men were, forces of nature in terms of personality. Their assistants were the longtime assistants, right? They stayed with them for their entire career. There's not this situation where I've been an assistant for you for 10 years. Now it's my time to go get my own head coaching job. That happens, but not for Gaither. He had the same coaches for like 30 years. Of his 25 years as coaching, he had the same coaches for almost, I want to say 20 out of 25 years of the same 3 or 4 coaches, right? That's the kind of consistency. Now, when he retired, those coaches and former players tried to replace him, and they did not meet the bar at Florida A&M, and they either resigned or got fired. And this sets the stage for Rudy Hubbard, who's now in the Black College Football Hall of Fame and in the College Football Hall of Fame, to really take over that program. I think the same challenges for Eddie Robinson, right? You coach for 40, 50 years. Your assistants, you have the same kind of people in your system. They don't get an opportunity. The other thing is, when we see moving in the way it matriculates in Black college football, you have a lot of programs having the same set of coaches for a really long time, and that the way that they replace those coaches is not going to get a Florida A&M alum. Is your first thing is to get one of your own assistant coaches in-house. And so the modern kind of coaching tree is not necessarily, I think, an apples to apples comparison. But Gaither, man, they love that guy. Even when people thought he was too conservative in the late 60s, his players absolutely adored him. And football in those days was hard. Like, a lot of dudes didn't come out of come off the freshman team, right? They never made it to varsity. But they could always felt like they could count on Gaither to give, to help them out and really be a mentor for them always.
Thank you. And I thank you both for joining us here today. Dr. Cavil, it was a pleasure watching you do what you do. I was taking notes for what I have to take over next time. And Dr. White, just thank you again. Before we go, can you all tell us about the other media platforms that you're on? So Dr. Cavil, I know you have Inside the HBCU Sports Lab, and then Dr. White, I know you have your podcast, which I make my students listen to.
Oh, good. No, I have, I'm on Twitter, at Blackstar1906. That's where I do most of my advertising for stuff. I also have a podcast. I'm the co-host of the Black Athlete Pod with Lewis Moore, professor at Grand Valley State and author of 2 books, I Fight for a Living, and We Will Win the Day. And so we record probably, once or twice a month. And, we try to contextualize a lot of the contemporary issues in history, right? We're trying to give you, this longer story, not just hot takes about whatever the issue is at this moment, but to really try to give, really lean into our expertise as historians and really think about how it is that we got to this particular moment. And I'm, email University of Kentucky History Department. That's all I got.
Dr. Cavil.
Yes, as you said, inside the HBCU Sports Lab every Tuesday and Thursday now, 6 o'clock Central Standard Time for an hour. We talk about everything about HBCU sports year round. So if you want to know that, you have an interest in that, you can talk about that. Obviously, during the fall football, during the winter, men's and women's basketball in the spring, we talk about the baseball and track and field. During the summer, we get a little fun. We do some of the stuff that you see now, where we talk about those that are doing research on HBCUs, and that's essentially how we got connected with Dr. White. So it's fascinating. You can also catch me as a guest analyst on HBCU Game Day. It's real popular out there, and so you can see me giving updates. And easiest way is to check me out and keep up with me on the social media platforms of Instagram, Twitter, as well as Facebook at Dr. Kenyatta Cavil. That's DrKenyattaCavil. Again, it's DrKenyattaCavil. And I told you about my responsibility full-time at Texas Southern University as a professor of sport management and sport entertainment.
Thank you both for coming. I appreciate you. I'm going to transition now into talking about what we're going to do for our next episode. So if you guys got to step away, I just appreciate your time. I know y'all got families and stuff. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, man. And there's some really great shots to the cat in the chat. Can I just answer two of these?
Yes, go ahead. Go for it. I
don't want to leave these folks. But Marcus Green talks about the bias of unfair state funding in the golden age. Absolutely. One of the key things I talk about in the book is the difference between that Black colleges lacked material resources, that they were not getting the kinds of funding streams that the predominantly white institutions were able to get, whether it's stadium money and building. These are often state funded through initiatives and not grants, but funding bills and whatnot. That creates a long legacy that affects Black colleges now. So when they were at their best, they could only hold, Florida A&M Stadium could only hold, I think, 10,000 folks at the most, whereas, University of Florida field could hold 50,000 and then 65,000. That allows for you to charge more money and that creates the widening gap. And so, of course, that impacts Black colleges all the way to the present, because now you don't have those kind of funding streams. Even when you have homecoming, you still have limited kind of space about what you could do for home football games. And then Brian asked about the MEAC departures. This is probably Dr. Cavil's kind of thing. Do Black conferences now? I don't know what's going to happen with the MEAC. I've had this question asked me earlier this week. I think the MEAC is a crucial moment for the MEAC, and they must make the right steps here, because wrong steps means the end of the MEAC. I'll just be as blunt as that. I think that is going to be, that's what's at stake. Losing A&T, which is obviously the strongest program, but also one of the largest institutions. Losing Florida A&M and Bethune-Cookman means you lose that southern wing where football is extremely serious. The way forward, in my opinion, and based on the history, is for Howard has to commit to athletics. They can't just be the capstone of Negro education anymore, that they have to be fully committed to being major players in the athletic realm. We talked about this long history of rivalries, and one of the rivalries that does not exist is with Howard University, because their commitment to big time Black college sports has been sporadic at best. And because of their name recognition, and because if they are committed, then they have to be the anchor for the MEAC. I think Florida A&M had been the anchor for a long time, one of the key anchors, and then A&T has now made themselves an anchor. And without both of those programs, the questions of the MEAC are I think, are up for debate, and I think it's something to be paying attention to.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I want to jump in there just quickly on. I agree with you totally in terms of the part of Howard, and it is a challenge for MEAC right now. I think they were fortunate because of what just took place, and things changed so quick that we got to keep on it, with the fact that now you have the teams leaving out of the Big South, going into the Sun Atlantic, and then you had the movement from the Southland with them going to the WAC. And so now you have these 5 or 6 conferences that are sitting at 5, 6 teams. And so now they don't look like the only school with only 6 schools. Now you have a bunch of these schools wanting to do their own thing. And so it'll be fascinating to see what that takes place, because now you have OVC with 6 teams, Sun Atlantic, obviously, A-Sun, I should say, with 5 teams. The Big South now with just 6, 7 schools, and the Southland with 6 schools, and now the WAC with 5 schools. So it's going to open up, which really gives the benefit to the SWAC with 12 schools. Mm-hmm. So one thing I would like to ask from a historical perspective before I turn it back over to Clark, I would like to ask that connection, as you talked about with FAMU on the SIAC and the weird arrangements they have with only playing a couple of teams. But you talk about historically, what does it look like for the SWAC now, being able to get SWAC, and you have essentially, other than maybe Tennessee State, with these fabulous teams now all together. What does that mean historically and now moving forward? What does that look like for the SWAC?
We've never had that ever in Black college, where all the the most powerful programs were all grouped together in a single conference, right? I think they've always been divided into 3 or 4 units because of geography, right? And I think that this is an interesting moment. I think Florida A&M, like, to not get into a lot of behind the scene details, but I think Florida A&M has always been a school that was a weird fit for a lot of reasons. Run geographically, just where it was in Florida. I think them and Bethune-Cookman were always the furthest south in any of these conferences. And the other part of it is that for a long time, Florida A&M, because they had gotten they had gotten accreditation considerably earlier in terms of its university status. They had a law school at one point, they closed and then reopened. That Florida A&M had always imagined itself as not as a teacher's college, to be perfectly honest, right? That they had always imagined themselves as a university, even though they were initially a normal school. And so they saw themselves as very different than something like Winston-Salem State, which was a teacher's college. And they were one of the A&Ms that tried to shed that kind of vocational legacy much earlier, because J.R.E. Lee is trying to get rid of that in the 1930s, right? He's trying to move them into what we think of as a classical, traditional university. So they are a little bit on the front end of those conversations. And so academically, they always have been looking at the AUC, or they've always been looking at Howard and Hampton as models about where they wanted to be. And the SWAC, which has a different kind of tradition coming out of the normal school tradition out of the SWAC, they saw that academically, they just were more aligned to those schools on the East Coast than they were in the Southwest. And I think but football wise, they were fit much better in the Southwest than they did on the East Coast, right? And so this is where athletically they are in the right place. It'll be interesting to see how they feel and how they're going to cooperate and really develop on the academic side of the table. Our fraternity brother Frederick Humphreys used to always brag that, we had more, FAMU had more merit scholars than anybody, right? Like more than Harvard. That was just as important as the band and in football and other things. And so that's been very much a part of FAMU's legacy and the way that they've imagined themselves and their future. And so athletic relationships help shape and reshape that imagine. I mean, the Ivy League, I always tell people, is an athletic conference. It is not a conference. It is an athletic association that we've ascribed academic meaning to, if that makes any sense, right?
And that was deep, yo.
So I think that's an important way. So FAMU going to the SWAC makes a lot of sense. It's probably made the most sense for 50 years for them to play football in the SWAC. but I think it's interesting to figure out where their administration is thinking about how does this fit them into. I think they've got, Prairie View's doing amazing things. I just did a talk there. Ruth Simmons is doing amazing things at Prairie View. I think Southern is really doing a lot of really good things and developing its pro. So I think there's a lot of really high-end academic things that are attractive that FAMU will want to be associated with, that are not Howard and Hampton and AUC, like the traditional kind of what we think of as the elite of HBCU life. We know that exists. So I think those are really important questions that are percolating that we can't see. I think the stuff on the field is going to be amazing. I think, FAMU opens with the Orange Blossom Classic. They play Jackson State. And then for homecoming, I think they got Southern. And I was telling colleagues, I was like, I'd like to come. I think it's time for me to come to Tallahassee and give my talk for both homecoming, and then I'm gonna go to Miami for this Orange Blossom Classic, right? So I'm already working the folds to make that happen. So yes. So again, I wanted to touch on those because those are really great questions, and I didn't want to leave those unanswered. And I thank you guys for having me, and we will be in contact. Keep up the good work, Langston, Dr. Cavil. I'm gonna see you on the Twitters, in the Twitter sphere, and keep up the good work. And please reach out. If anybody has any questions, just reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out. And I look forward to the conversation. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you both for having us.